the WTA Commissioner didn't hold back. Holger Rune's secret apartment meeting with Alex Eala was about to become the scandal that nobody saw coming. What started as whispers in the hallways of Roland Garros turned into a full-blown investigation that shook the foundations of professional tennis. A private encounter, a public explosion, and a young star caught in the crossfire of something she never asked for. This isn't just about a meeting, it's about power, protection, and the line that should never be crossed. Paris in late spring has always been magical for tennis players. The red clay of Roland Garros, the sound of balls echoing through packed stadiums, the dreams of Grand Slam glory hanging in the air like morning mist over the Seine. But in May 2024, something happened in Paris that had nothing to do with trophy presentations or championship points. Something that would turn the tennis world upside down and put two young stars at the center of a storm neither of them saw coming. Alex Eala was riding high. The 19-year-old Filipino sensation had just secured her spot in the main draw of the French Open qualifiers, a monumental achievement for someone who had spent years grinding through the lower circuits. Her story was the kind that inspired documentaries. A teenager from Manila who trained in Spain, fought through injuries, and clawed her way into the conversation of future Grand Slam contenders. Every interview she gave was filled with grace, humility, and determination. She was the pride of the Philippines, carrying the hopes of an entire nation on her shoulders. Holger Rune was a different kind of story. The Danish prodigy had already broken into the top 10, had defeated Rafael Nadal on clay, and had developed a reputation for being both brilliant and combustible. At just 21, he was known for his intensity, his fiery on-court emotions, and his reluctance to play by the old rules of tennis etiquette. He was the future of men's tennis, whether people liked his attitude or not. These two worlds should never have collided. The WTA and ATP tours run parallel but separate. Men and women train differently, compete differently, and navigate entirely different professional landscapes. So when rumors began circulating that Holger Rune had been seen entering Alex Eala's rented apartment in the 16th arrondissement of Paris late one evening during the tournament, eyebrows were raised immediately. At first, it seemed like nothing. Players socialize. They train together sometimes. The tennis community is small, interconnected, and full of friendships that cross gender and nationality lines. But this wasn't a casual coffee meetup at a public cafe. This was a private apartment, late evening, and according to building security footage that would later be leaked to a French sports blog, Rune stayed for over 2 hours. The whispers started in the player lounges, then the coaches began talking, then the agents, and within 48 hours, the story had reached the desks of both the WTA and ATP leadership. What was supposed to be a private moment between two consenting adults had become a procedural nightmare because Alex Eala was not just any player. She was 19. She was unsponsored by major brands yet. She was vulnerable in ways that tour veterans were not. And the optics of a top 10 male player visiting her privately without any professional reason set off alarm bells that no one could ignore. The WTA had spent years building protocols to protect younger players from exploitation, from inappropriate relationships with coaches, from power imbalances that could derail careers before they even began. This situation, whether innocent or not, looked like everything those protocols were designed to prevent, and the moment it became public knowledge, there was no turning back. But here's what nobody knew yet. Alex Eala wasn't the one who reported it. So who did? And why did this meeting matter so much to people who weren't even in the room? When the story first broke on a niche tennis Twitter account with just 3,000 followers, it seemed destined to fade into obscurity. The post was vague, just a blurry photo of someone who looked like Holger Rune entering a Parisian apartment building with the caption, "Interesting company for rising WTA stars during RG week, more to come." No names, no accusations, just enough to get people talking. But tennis fans are relentless. Within hours, amateur sleuths had geolocated the building, cross-referenced player accommodation lists leaked from previous years, and identified the apartment as one rented under Alex Eala's team management. The speculation exploded. Was this a relationship? A coaching arrangement? Something darker? The comments section became a battlefield of assumptions, most of them wildly off base, but all of them damaging. And through it all, Alex Eala said nothing. Her social media, usually active with training updates and grateful messages to fans, went dark. Her team released no statement. Her agent declined all interview requests. The silence was deafening. And in the world of modern sports media, silence is never interpreted as innocence. Silence looks like guilt. Silence looks like something to hide. Fans began dissecting her every previous interaction with male players. Old photos from practice sessions were scrutinized. Innocent Instagram story replies were reframed as evidence of impropriety. The Filipino tennis community, so proud of their trailblazer, was divided. Some defended her unconditionally. Others demanded answers. The pressure was immense, and it was all focused on a teenager who was just trying to play tennis. But why didn't she speak? Why didn't her team issue a simple clarification, a straightforward explanation that could have ended the speculation immediately? Those close to the situation would later reveal the answer, and it was more complicated than anyone expected. Alex Eala had been advised by her legal team to say nothing, not because she had done anything wrong, but because anything she said could be used in an ongoing WTA investigation that she hadn't even known was happening until it was too late. The WTA had opened a formal inquiry the moment the story gained traction. They had interviewed building staff, reviewed security footage, and reached out to both Eala's and Rune's management teams for comment. This wasn't just a PR problem anymore. This was an official investigation into potential violations of player conduct codes, codes designed to prevent exactly the kind of power imbalance situations that the optics of this meeting suggested. Eala was caught in an impossible position. If she defended Rune, she risked angering the WTA and looking complicit in whatever they were investigating. If she stayed silent, public opinion would destroy her. And if she condemned him, she would be lying about a meeting that, by all accounts from those who actually knew what happened, was completely innocent. The truth, as it would later emerge, was painfully simple. Holger Rune had reached out to Alex Eala through mutual coaching contacts to discuss clay court strategy. Rune, despite his success, was known to be obsessive about improvement, constantly seeking advice from players with different perspectives. Eala, who had trained at the Rafa Nadal Academy and had an intricate understanding of clay court positioning, had insights that Rune wanted to hear. They had met in her apartment rather than a public space because Rune was trying to avoid the constant attention that followed him everywhere in Paris. It was a professional conversation between two professionals. But none of that mattered now. The narrative had been written, and Alex Eala's silence had accidentally confirmed the worst version of the story in the minds of millions. While Eala stayed quiet, Holger Rune was about to make the biggest mistake of his career, and his words would give the WTA exactly what they needed to bring the hammer down. Holger Rune had never been good at staying quiet. His entire career had been defined by his refusal to conform, his willingness to speak his mind even when it got him into trouble, his belief that authenticity mattered more than public relations polish. So, when the rumors about the apartment meeting began to spiral out of control, his team knew they had a choice. Let it blow over naturally or get ahead of it with a strong, definitive statement. They chose the latter, and it was a disaster. The statement was released on Rune's official Instagram account on a Thursday afternoon, just as the French Open main draw was getting underway. It was clearly written by a lawyer, full of formal language and defensive phrasing, but Rune had apparently insisted on adding his own commentary at the end. The result was a confusing mix of corporate speak and personal frustration that satisfied no one and inflamed everyone. The statement read, in part, "Recent speculation regarding my private interactions with fellow tennis professionals is both inaccurate and invasive. I have always conducted myself with the highest level of professionalism and respect. My meeting with Alex Eala was entirely appropriate and centered on tennis strategy and shared professional interests. The suggestion of anything improper is offensive and defamatory." That part was fine. Standard crisis management. But then came Rune's personal edition. "I'm tired of people trying to control who I talk to and when I talk to them. Tennis is a small world, and we're all trying to get better. If people want to make something dirty out of a normal conversation, that says more about them than it does about me. Alex is a talented player, and I won't apologize for respecting her game." The backlash was immediate and brutal. The problem wasn't what Rune said, it was what he failed to understand. By centering himself in the narrative, by making it about his frustration and his reputation, he had inadvertently made Alex Eala's silence look even more suspicious. If the meeting was so innocent, why wasn't she saying the same thing? If they were on the same page, why were their responses so different? Tennis journalists pounced. Think pieces appeared within hours. Holger Rune's privilege on full display, read one headline. When men don't understand the problem, they become the problem, read another. Female players, both current and retired, began weighing in on social media, not directly naming Rune, but making pointed comments about male players who don't get it and the importance of protecting younger women in the sport. Rune's team scrambled. They released a follow-up clarification, but the damage was done. The ATP, which had initially stayed out of the situation, was now being pressured to make a statement. Sponsors began quiet conversations about whether Rune's brand was becoming too toxic, and the French Tennis Federation, hosting the tournament where all of this was unfolding, was desperately trying to keep the focus on the actual competition. But the worst was yet to come. Because while Rune was busy defending himself on social media and in press conferences, the WTA was conducting its investigation, and what they found gave them everything they needed to make this an official matter rather than just the tabloid story. The WTA's Player Conduct Code includes specific provisions about interactions between players that could create the appearance of impropriety or power imbalance. The code doesn't require proof of wrongdoing. It requires only that the situation could reasonably be perceived as problematic by a neutral observer. And a top 10 male player visiting a teenage female player's private residence late at night, regardless of the reason, absolutely met that standard. The WTA also uncovered something else. This wasn't the first time Rune had reached out to younger WTA players for strategy sessions. There were messages documented through tour communication channels showing a pattern of contact that, while never explicitly inappropriate, raised questions about boundaries and intentions. None of this proved Rune had done anything predatory, but in the court of public opinion, and in the eyes of an organization desperate to protect its athletes, it didn't have to. The optics were bad, the pattern was concerning, and Holger Rune's defensive, tone-deaf response had eliminated any benefit of the doubt he might have had. And then the WTA Commissioner made a decision that would change everything. The words she chose didn't just condemn Rune's actions, they obliterated his defense entirely. Mickey Lawler had been the president of the WTA for years, navigating the organization through sponsorship deals, equal pay battles, and the constant challenge of promoting women's tennis in a sports world that often treated it as secondary to the men's game. She was known for being diplomatic, strategic, and careful with her words. She understood that every statement she made represented not just her personal views, but the position of an entire organization representing hundreds of female athletes across the globe. So when Mickey Lawler decided to release a public statement about the Holger Rune and Alex Eala situation, everyone in tennis knew it was serious. This wasn't a routine press release. This was a line in the sand. The statement was released on the official WTA website and simultaneously shared across all WTA social media platforms. It was titled simply, "Regarding Player Safety and Appropriate Conduct," and it didn't waste any words. The WTA has completed a preliminary review of the recent situation involving one of our players and an ATP competitor. While we cannot discuss the specifics of ongoing player matters, we want to be unequivocally clear about our position. The safety, well-being, and professional development of our athletes, particularly our younger players, is our highest priority. Any interaction, regardless of intent, that creates an environment where a player feels pressured, uncomfortable, or professionally compromised will be taken seriously and addressed appropriately. That paragraph alone was enough to send shockwaves through the tennis world, but Lawler didn't stop there. We recognize that professional tennis is a global community where players naturally interact across tours and organizations. However, there are boundaries that must be respected, particularly when there are significant disparities in ranking, experience, and professional power. The responsibility to maintain those boundaries falls most heavily on those with the most privilege and platform. When those boundaries are blurred, intentionally or otherwise, it creates risks that we cannot and will not tolerate. The statement was masterful in its construction. It never mentioned Holger Rune by name, it never explicitly accused him of wrongdoing, but every single word was designed to make one thing absolutely clear. The WTA believed that Rune had crossed a line, that Alex Eala had been put in a compromised position, and that this would not be swept under the rug. The final paragraph was the one that would be quoted in every sports news outlet for the next week. To the ATP, to male players, and to the broader tennis community, our athletes are not available for mentorship, strategy sessions, or private meetings that bypass professional channels and appropriate supervision. If you want to help the next generation of women's tennis, do it publicly, do it transparently, and do it through the proper organizational structures that exist for exactly this purpose. Anything less is unacceptable. The reaction was instantaneous. The statement had effectively crushed Holger Rune's entire defense. He had framed the meeting as innocent professional networking. The WTA Commissioner had just declared that private meetings of that nature were in themselves inappropriate regardless of intent. She had removed the question of what happened and replaced it with, "This should never have happened at all." Tennis Twitter erupted. Female players, both active and retired, rallied behind the statement with messages of support and gratitude. Male players were noticeably quiet, with only a few veterans willing to wade into the controversy. Andy Murray, always vocal about women's issues in tennis, tweeted simply, "Important statement, important boundaries, important precedent." But the most telling response came from the ATP itself, which released a terse statement hours later acknowledging the WTA's position and committing to reviewing our own player conduct guidelines to ensure alignment with best practices for cross-tour interactions. It was diplomatic enough, but everyone understood the subtext. The ATP had been caught completely off guard and now was scrambling to avoid looking complicit in what the WTA had just characterized as a systemic problem. Holger Rune's team went into crisis mode. They released yet another statement, this one far more contrite, acknowledging that while his intentions had been misunderstood, he recognized that his actions had created an inappropriate situation. He apologized directly to Alex Eala, to the WTA, and to anyone who had been made uncomfortable with the incident. It was the right response, but it came too late. The narrative was set. The commissioner had spoken, and Rune was, for all practical purposes, publicly crushed. But the story wasn't over, because while the officials and organizations were making statements, the real tennis world, the players, the fans, the people who lived and breathed the sport, were about to make their voices heard, and they were far from unified. In the days following the WTA Commissioner's statement, professional tennis became a battlefield of opinions, tribal loyalties, and moral arguments that had been simmering beneath the surface for years. This wasn't just about Holger Rune and Alex Eala anymore. This was about power, gender, privilege, and the future of how tennis would handle relationships between male and female athletes. The response from female players was almost universally supportive of the WTA's position. Ons Jabeur, always thoughtful in her public comments, posted on Instagram, "Protection isn't about mistrust. It's about creating environments where everyone can thrive without second-guessing intentions. Grateful for leadership that prioritizes our well-being." Jessica Pegula, known for her no-nonsense approach, was more direct. "Boundaries exist for a reason. Respect them." But it was the younger players, the ones closest in age to Alex Eala, who were most vocal. Coco Gauff, in a podcast interview recorded days after the incident, didn't hold back. "I think sometimes male players don't realize the position they put us in. Like, we're supposed to be grateful for their attention, their advice, their time. But when it's behind closed doors, when there's no one else around, it changes what that interaction means. It just does." The men's side was far more divided. Some players rushed to Rune's defense, arguing that the WTA had overreacted and turned an innocent meeting into a scandal. Others stayed silent, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, but unwilling to publicly take sides. A few, mostly veterans, supported the WTA's position, recognizing that the optics mattered even if the intentions were pure. But it was on social media where the real war was being fought. Tennis fans, split largely along gender lines, turned the comment sections of every tennis post into debates about whether the WTA had gone too far or hadn't gone far enough. Rune's supporters argued that he was being vilified for trying to help a younger player, that the WTA was being hypocritical and overprotective, and that this kind of reaction would only discourage cross-tour friendships and mentorship. The counter-argument was equally passionate, that women in tennis had spent decades dealing with inappropriate behavior from male players, coaches, and officials, and that the WTA's strong stance was long overdue. They pointed to the documented history of female players being exploited, harassed, or put in compromising situations by men in positions of power. They argued that even if Rune's intentions were pure, the lack of transparency and professional structure around the meeting was exactly the problem. The media coverage was relentless. Sports journalists wrote op-eds arguing every conceivable angle. Some framed the story as a cautionary tale about social media witch hunts and the dangers of assuming guilt without evidence. Others praised the WTA for taking a stand that might prevent future, more serious incidents. A few attempted nuanced takes that acknowledged the complexity of the situation, but those pieces got lost in the noise of hot takes and click-driven outrage. Television sports shows dedicated entire segments to the controversy. Retired players were brought on as experts, and their opinions were as divided as everyone else's. Martina Navratilova, never one to shy away from difficult topics, said in an interview, "I understand the WTA's position completely, but I also worry that we're creating a world where men and women in tennis can't have normal professional relationships without everything being scrutinized. There has to be a middle ground." That middle ground, however, seemed impossible to find, because buried beneath all the arguments about the specific incident was a fundamental question that tennis had never fully answered. How do you create a professional environment where male and female athletes can interact, collaborate, and support each other, while also protecting the vulnerable from exploitation? The WTA had chosen to err on the side of protection. The ATP seemed unsure of how to respond. And caught in the middle were two young players whose careers would forever be marked by a meeting that lasted 2 hours but generated months of conversation. Sponsorship deals were quietly reassessed. Holger Rune's major apparel sponsor released a vague statement about monitoring the situation and upholding values of respect and professionalism. Alex Eala, who had been in talks with several brands about potential endorsement deals, saw those conversations stall indefinitely. Nobody wanted to be associated with controversy, regardless of fault. Tournament organizers began implementing new protocols. Private meetings between players of different tours now required chaperones or documentation. Some players complained about the new restrictions, calling them infantilizing and unnecessary. Others welcomed them, seeing them as overdue protections that should have existed all along. As the dust began to settle and the news cycle moved on to the next scandal, one question remained unanswered. What actually happened to the two people at the center of the storm? Where were Alex Eala and Holger Rune now? And what did this mean for their futures? 6 months after the incident, the tennis world had moved on to new storylines, new champions, and new controversies. But for Alex Eala and Holger Rune, the aftermath of that Paris apartment meeting continued to shape their careers in ways both visible and invisible. Alex Eala finally broke her silence in an interview with a Filipino sports network, her first public comments about the situation. She was poised, careful, and clearly still processing the weight of what had happened. When asked directly about the meeting, she said, "It was a conversation about tennis. That's all it ever was. But I understand why people were concerned, and I understand why the WTA felt they needed to step in. I never wanted to be part of a controversy, but I also don't regret having professional conversations with other players who want to get better." She was then asked if she felt victimized by the situation. Her answer was revealing. "I think the word victim is complicated. Was I put in a difficult position? Yes. Did I feel pressure and scrutiny that was unfair? Absolutely. But do I think the WTA's response was wrong? No, because the reality is that there are situations in tennis, and in sports generally, where young women are taken advantage of, and if this incident helps prevent that from happening to someone else, then maybe something good came from it." Her maturity and nuance earned widespread praise, but it also highlighted the impossible standard she had been held to throughout the ordeal. She had to be strong enough to defend herself, but not so defensive that she appeared ungrateful for the WTA's protection. She had to acknowledge the validity of concerns without admitting to being a victim. She had to move forward while carrying the weight of being that player who was at the center of the scandal. Holger Rune's path was different, but equally complicated. His ranking remained solid, and he continued to compete at the highest levels of men's tennis, but the incident had cost him in ways that statistics couldn't measure. Major sponsorship deals that had been in negotiation fell through. His social media presence, once bold and unapologetic, became cautious and carefully managed. He rarely gave interviews that weren't strictly about match results. When he did address the situation, months later in a Danish newspaper interview, his perspective had clearly evolved. I learned that intentions don't matter as much as impact. I thought I was just talking tennis with a colleague, but I didn't consider how it would look, how it would feel for her, or what it would mean in the bigger context of how men and women interact in our sport. That was naive, and it was wrong. He also spoke about the WTA Commissioner statement, the one that had crushed his initial defense. At the time, I was angry. I felt attacked and misunderstood, but she was right. Not about my intentions, but about the structure and boundaries that need to exist. If I want to help younger players, male or female, there are proper ways to do it. I didn't follow those ways, and that's on me. The incident became a case study. Tennis organizations around the world used it in player education programs about professional conduct and appropriate boundaries. Sports psychology courses analyzed the communication breakdown and public response, and in quiet conversations among players, agents, and coaches, it became a reference point. Remember the Rune Eala situation? Let's make sure we don't do that. The WTA's firm stance set a precedent that rippled through women's sports more broadly. Other organizations began reviewing and strengthening their own policies around cross-gender professional interactions. Some criticized these changes as overly restrictive, arguing that they treated adult athletes like children. Others saw them as necessary steps towards creating truly safe professional environments. But perhaps the most significant impact was cultural. The incident forced a conversation that tennis had been avoiding for years. It made players, coaches, organizations, and fans confront uncomfortable questions about power, privilege, and protection. It challenged the notion that good intentions were enough, and it made clear that in the modern era of sports, transparency and professional structures weren't optional. They were essential. Alex Eala continued her climb through the rankings, qualifying for more Grand Slam main draws and slowly building the career that everyone had predicted for her. She rarely spoke about the incident, but those close to her said it had changed her. She was more cautious about private interactions, more aware of how her actions could be perceived, and more protective of her public image. Some saw this as unfortunate, a loss of innocence and spontaneity. Others saw it as necessary growth in a professional world that demanded constant awareness. Holger Rune's career trajectory remained strong, but he never quite recaptured the fearless, unapologetic energy that had defined his early rise. He became more measured, more diplomatic, more careful. Whether this made him a better ambassador for the sport or robbed him of the edge that had made him special was a matter of ongoing debate. The tennis world had survived the scandal, as it had survived so many before, but it had also been changed by it. The rules were clearer now, the boundaries were firmer, and the conversation about how to protect athletes while allowing them to build meaningful professional relationships continued, because there were no easy answers, and never would be. So here's the question that still lingers. Was this scandal the price of progress, or was it an overreaction that damaged two careers for a mistaken judgment? Did the WTA do the right thing, or did they turn a private conversation into a public execution? And most importantly, what happens the next time a male player wants to help a young woman in tennis? Will he think twice? Should he? The story of Holger Rune and Alex Eala isn't just about one meeting in a Paris apartment. It's about the evolution of professional sports, the ongoing struggle to balance protection with freedom, and the reality that in the age of social media and heightened awareness, every action carries consequences far beyond the people directly involved. The WTA Commissioner made a choice. She chose protection over public relations, boundaries over benefit of the doubt, and precedent over popularity. Whether history will judge that choice as courageous or excessive remains to be seen. But one thing is certain, tennis will never approach these situations the same way again.